So I want to start off by thanking the Friends of the Library for helping to sponsor this talk, and I'm so grateful to be able to come here and speak with you tonight. So bonsoir. Je vais vous... J'ai une histoire à vous raconter. Good evening. I'm very happy to be here, and I have a story to tell you. We're going to start off with a quote from someone, and this is from former Massachusetts Senator F.K. Foster. The French Canadians are ignorant, immoral, much worse than the Chinese of California, and a blight on society. The possibility of reinventing oneself, of leaving everything behind and moving into a future that has no past, has been compelling for many people who immigrated to the United States. But I ask, what happens when one works hard being like everyone else? And who is the everyone else we thrive or work so hard to be? For even those of us with roots in Western Europe are different from one another. The French are not like the English, the Italians are not like the Germans, etc., etc. I believe passionately that our individual and cultural narratives are essential for us all. In fact, I believe their loss is detrimental to our well-being as a nation. How can we be asked to respect these people of different cultures if we don't even know our own cultural story? So tonight, I will be interspersing my personal memories as a Franco-American growing up in New England, alongside the history of the French in the Americas. As Jennifer Lee, a Native American storyteller, says, to know what happened can empower and inform you, and I concur. The story of the French in the Americas is not well known. For those of us with a French background, and how many of us have some French background? Thank you. This is an ancestral tale that has touched us all in one way or another. And for those who are not French, perhaps you'll learn a little bit of American history you are not familiar with. More importantly, perhaps you'll be prompted to get to know your own cultural story. Worse yet, they had interiorized the negative image that the Americans and even their own elite attributed to them. Indeed, educated people keep telling us, the English have told us, we are dumb and we believed it. We keep repeating it at home, in the street. We have really gotten the idea. The Francos will never set the world on fire. Growing up, I personally felt deeply the challenges of being French in New England. I was shaped by a people whose self-perception was founded on weakness, not strength, burdened by feelings of inferiority and unspoken rage. They felt shame. I felt shame. There was so much I didn't understand. I'll admit that what I've just shared with you is not easy for me to say in public. I always thought I was the only one who had feelings and experiences such as these. But by trusting that what I experienced was real, I've discovered a very important and interesting story, which I am about to share with you. So I'm going to start off by sharing with you my ancestral roots. My ancestral roots lie in France, Quebec, Old Acadie, the Algonquin nation, and England. So I joke that all the warring factions circulate in my blood, because it's pretty much true. I was the oldest child born in Western Massachusetts, and French was my first language until I began school at about the age of 5. At an early age, I came to understand that the French I spoke was derided in some quarters, and I just couldn't understand why. In the late 1970s, I moved from New Hampshire to Denver, Colorado. And while there, I had two experiences that really, unbeknownst to me at the time, shaped the future of my life. The first thing, I observed how the people in Colorado treated the Mexicans. And I remember thinking, this feels very familiar because I saw disdain and disrespect. And it felt familiar to me because I had experienced that as a Franco-American in New England. The second point was that when some folks found out that I could speak French, they were very impressed. And this was something that totally shocked me because I'd always felt shame about the fact that I could speak that language. And so this changed my thinking, started changing my thinking. So through the years when I told people in New England that I spoke French, I'd often been asked, do you speak French Canadian? Do you speak Canuck? And I wanted to know, why are these questions asked? Here's what I discovered, and we're going to talk about this for a few minutes. In 20th century America, so-called Parisian French became the standard for educated classes in the United States, and Acadiens, Canadien pronunciations were derided as just rural French or not real French. There's no such language as French Canadian or Canuck. I speak French. Yes, I admit that I speak French with the pronunciation from my grandmother and my bilingual mother. It is different than the French spoken in other parts of the world, but it is real French. What's the story? What's this all about? Well, in Acadie in Canada, at the time of their coming here in the 1600s, of course there was no TV, there was no radio, so that the pronunciation they brought from France was retained in Canada. And this pronunciation was different in Acadie even than in Quebec, which was very fascinating to me when I discovered this. And they kept this pronunciation into the 19th and 20th centuries because they lived in small, isolated villages, and so it was easy to retain that pronunciation. I'm noticing now that it's changing a lot with the advent of TV and radio. There's a big change, and I don't hear the old pronunciation like I used to. Sometimes on the music I do, but for the most part I think that is really changing up north. The big thing is, we've got to remember, it's real French. It's actually the French of Molière, Rousseau, and King Louis XIV. So I don't think there's any reason now that we have to apologize for this, those of us who learned this pronunciation as children or heard it. And here's another story that was told to me by Dr. Leslie Chuckett from Assumption College, I think now Assumption University in Worcester. In the late 1990s, there was an exhibition on the development of the French language at the Pompidou Center in Paris. As part of this exhibition, someone had reconstructed a speech given by King Louis XIV, and the Québecois who attended were thrilled when they heard this tape. They said, "He sounds just like us." Ooh, very interesting. And there are a lot of old words, too, that we learned that don't even exist in France anymore, but, you know, some of us know those words as well. So since we're going to literally be taking a speed train through history, and I'm warning you, we are, I thought it might be useful to offer a timeline as an aid. We're going to revisit this slide throughout the first part of the presentation. So contrasting the history of Old World England to that of Old World France is notable, for these two countries were very important players, as we would remember from our American history, in the history of the early settling of North America. I hope these facts help because they're important and they set the stage for the political climate and attitudes that became established later on. In 1215, in England, the Magna Carta was signed. And over time, this document did three things. It helped curb the power of the monarchy, a parliament was formed, and eventually self-representative government became established. So that by the 1600s, this existed in England and it was brought over to the Americas. We're now going to look at a brief look at Old World France. What was happening there around that time? Well, between 1598 and 1643, three men in France laid the foundations for the absolutist monarchy that was to reach its peak under King Louis XIV. No limits like the Magna Carta in England were imposed. And we must remember that King Louis XIV was in power for 73 years. And so this system of government was brought over to the Americas by the French. At the same time, France still retained elements of the old feudal system. So unlike the English colonists of the 1600s, French colonists had absolutely no experience in representative governance. I told you we're going fast. In this segment, we're going to give a bit of historical background on the three groups of people found in Northeast America in the 1600s. So the indigenous peoples, the English, and the French. We'll also explore briefly the motivations bringing these Europeans to the Americas. So natives of the Northeast were linked by language, especially on the Northeast coast. And it's Algonquin is the language that, it wasn't all the same language, but it was related. But each of these nations had their own unique systems and cultures and customs. They weren't one people, one culture living under the same rules like we were led to believe in our history classes. Along the North Atlantic coast, which is New England today, most indigenous groups had transitioned to farming and lived in villages. When the English and the French arrived here, enemies from far back, remember, they brought their international conflicts with them, and native nations, which were caught up in their own ongoing struggles, attempted to adjust to these new political realities brought about by the European presence, and it was a tumultuous period for them. In addition, Europeans introduced previously unknown diseases to these shores, and 80 to 90% of the native peoples living here died at that time in those early years. This is shocking, really, when we think of it. So not only were there great differences between the English and the French styles of governments when they came from Europe, there was also a stark contrast to the way the English and the French rulers viewed their role in the Americas. Early on, English territorial claims were limited, and I was trying to use the little pointer, but it doesn't work on my slides. Anyway, the area in brown, which we know of mostly as New England, is the area that the English claimed as their own. The focus was on colonization for the English, and this is really important to remember. The British monarchs remained engaged in this territory through the years, for the rulers believed that control of the new land would be to their benefit and could result in commercial and economic domination, and as we know, this did come to pass. Contrary to the English, colonization was not a primary concern for the French monarchs. Their initial interest was in collecting gold and silver because of what had happened to the south with the Spanish. When it became clear that these were not to be found up here, the revenues were exacted from the very lucrative fur trade. Colonization wasn't all that important to the French government, yet when you look at this map, all the area in blue was claimed by the French and called La Nouvelle France. But the vastness of this territory made it very difficult to govern, and as early as 1672, the energy of the French monarch turned to European domination, and interest in the new colony flagged. This date is very important. It's going to come up again as we discover how this decision had direct repercussions on the lives of French colonists living in the Americas by then. So although France claimed a great deal of territory in the Americas, there were only two major French settlements in La Nouvelle France. One area called l'Acadie and Canada. So this ends the sort of backstory historical portion of this presentation. And now's the time for the more personal stories of the Acadiens and the Canadiens. If you know these songs, please join me. À la claire fontaine m'en allant promener, j'ai trouvé l'eau si belle que je me suis baignée. Il y a longtemps que je t'aime, jamais je ne t'oublierai. So, music, very important part of our people's lives. I've decided I'm not going to translate these. It's very difficult to translate them directly, but I'll give you a general idea of what these songs are about. This is a love song. It was brought over from France, and it exists in many French-speaking parts of the world with some differences. I believe that this song can be interpreted as a song that speaks of the French people's love for their country. I will never forget you, jamais je ne t'oublierai. So we're going to start off with Acadie. Does anyone know if they have any roots in Acadie? Do you have any idea? Some of you do. Okay, great.
Was New Brunswick part of Acadia?
Yes, it's the Maritime Provinces now. Mm-hmm. Yep. So the region known on this map is what we now call the Maritime Provinces. And in the 1600s, the indigenous peoples living here were the Abenaki, the Malecite, and the Mi'kmaq. They weren't settled in farming communities, however, like in the south, but they were still hunter-gatherers who were changing locations according to the seasons. Port-Royal, which is now called Annapolis Royal in Nova Scotia, was founded in 1605. Since the Mi'kmaq lived in this particular area, they were essential in helping the French immigrants adjust to life in this cold, harsh land. They formed trading partnerships, and in the early years, intermarriage was not that uncommon. Unlike what happened to the south in New England, where competition for land between the English and the indigenous peoples caused serious problems for the natives, there was little competition between the native people and the French living in or coming to Acadie. I'm particularly referring to, at this point, to Nova Scotia. For the French chose to settle marshy coastlands, areas not commonly used by the Mi'kmaq. And over the years, using a unique dike system, the French immigrants worked hard to reclaim and develop this marshland into successful, productive farmland. It was a life of much hardship, but they also knew how to enjoy themselves. Faith and family meant everything to them. They gathered together often to play music, dance, tell stories, and laugh. These get-togethers gave them much joy. On est parti de Bram village, c'est aujourd'hui le festival. On a passé par Saint-Gilbert, c'était pour ramasser Albert. Puis s'envoyer de l'avant nos gens, puis s'envoyer de l'avant, puis s'envoyer de l'avant nos gens, puis s'envoyer de l'avant. This is a story of a group of friends joining up to celebrate a feast day. It's a traditional Acadien song, and yet there's a Quebec version with different words but the same music. I discovered that later and thought that was interesting. Since control of Acadie vacillated between the English and the French over a period of many years, the French immigrants in Acadie lived without the constant oversight of the French government or of the Catholic Church because that operated out of Canada. This is very significant. For over the years, these French immigrants in Acadie developed practices of rudimentary self-government, learning valuable lessons from the English, who were their trading partners and occasional overlords. They also learned from their native neighbors and friends, who had different approaches to leadership. And in the early years, these French settlers maneuvered through the minefields of French and British demands, using their innate wiliness to get what they wanted. And they did this without violence or warfare. This is remarkable to me. This is a people who had always lived under a strong authoritarian system, vested in church and state, and they had been allowed no experience in self-governance at all. And they learned over time that life could be different, and they decided to follow this new path. This happened long before the French Revolution took place in France. By the late 1600s, the territory known as Acadie had expanded, so it now included not only Nova Scotia, but also Ile Saint-Jean, which is now PEI, Ile Royale, which is Cape Breton Island, as well as New Brunswick and a good part of northern Maine. Le matin quand je m'y lève, et hop, et tralalala. Le matin quand je m'y lève, c'est au bois que je m'en vais. C'est au bois que je m'en vais, c'est au bois que je m'en vais. Ah, j'ai bien dit à ma femme, et hop, et tralalala. Ah, j'ai bien dit à ma femme, mon dîner m'apportera. So there's this guy going off to work in the woods of Maine or Nova Scotia, who knows, somewhere in Acadia, and he tells his wife he expects her to bring his dinner every day. Well, I'm not singing the whole story. She has a surprise for him at the end, I'll tell you. So remember that I mentioned just a few minutes ago about the date 1672. It's really the only date to remember in this talk. This was when the energy of the French government was being deflected away from la Nouvelle France toward Europe. The following is one example of how it played out in the Americas. In 1713, a part of French Acadie, which is Nova Scotia today, was officially handed over to Britain by the French government. The rest of Acadie remained in French hands. As a consequence of this decision, the French government and the Catholic Church operating out of Canada wanted the French who were living in Nova Scotia to move to lands controlled by the French. But most chose to stay in place, for this had been their home for almost 100 years. Why take a chance with the unknown? Understandably, this did not endear them to the French and Catholic leaders in Canada who demanded absolute obedience to their wishes. So after 1713, with this territory, Nova Scotia, being in British hands, the Acadiens who remained there were allowed to elect men to represent them with negotiations with British leaders. However, they also insisted the Acadiens take an oath of allegiance to the British king. Now, this was a very serious dilemma for them, because conflicts between the French and the English didn't end with this treaty, and if the Acadiens took the oath, that meant they would be obliged to fight against their French cousins. So over time, they decided to refuse to align with either the French or the British government. But by choosing to remain neutral in a political environment that demanded that you take sides, they would suffer serious consequences. They would find themselves alone in their hour of need. Later, the Acadiens would agree to sign an oath of allegiance, but it was based on their neutrality. The understanding was that the British would not force them to fight against the French. Misunderstandings arose later with this decision, and this led to a very precarious situation for them. So I'm going to interrupt this presentation for just a second by saying this, that there are always two sides to a story, and each side makes its case for its actions. So I realize full well that in this telling, I'm simplifying an extremely complicated story. Focusing on details is not my intent. I'm more interested in understanding how history impacts people and shapes cultures. I prefer to look at my work as akin to creating a patchwork quilt that symbolizes the stories, voices, and shared history of a people. If you prefer to pick the quilt apart, there are many sources that provide a more in-depth, focused view. And let me say at this point, on the table here, I have a list of books. If you really love to read, you like history, please feel free to pick it up. And on the other side, I have a list of music from Quebec and Acadie and from the Cajuns. So what happened? Well, in the spring of 1755, the leader of Nova Scotia and the governor of Massachusetts determined that this land, that is Nova Scotia specifically, would now be only for the British. There were already 7,000 Massachusetts troops in Nova Scotia, and in the fall of that year, in an event that became known as Le Grand Dérangement, the Great Disturbance, thousands were violently removed from their homes. In the ensuing chaos, many family groups were separated. Not only were the people torn from their homes and from each other, but all they had worked for was destroyed. Their homes, their crops, their livestock, everything. Their native neighbors and relatives tried to help, but neither the Canadiens nor the French soldiers from Canada came to their aid. They were left on their own against the powerful British who were intent on taking everything away from them. This was ethnic cleansing at a time when the phrase did not yet exist. The Acadiens were placed on cargo ships which had been refitted for human cargo, much like the vessels used in the slave trade. And by the end of 1755, nearly 7,000 people were forcibly removed in those terrible days. Many were lost in storms encountered as they traveled south toward New England and beyond. On November 5th, 1755, 6 ships headed for ports along the Atlantic coast limped into Boston Harbor. Massachusetts authorities who boarded the ships found appalling conditions on board: overcrowding, illness, bad water, inadequate provisions. From Boston, the ships were sent down the eastern seaboard. No port city was alerted to their coming, and the exiles encountered fear and prejudice wherever they were deposited. For example, those who landed in Virginia were immediately sent to England, where they were imprisoned. It's amazing. This story is very sad. Roughly 1,000 of the 7,000 died in transit that first deportation, while others, weakened by the voyage, died after they arrived at their destinations. The deportation lasted 9 years, and it later expanded beyond the boundaries of Nova Scotia. Of the 13 or 14,000 Acadiens living in the region, 11,500, that is 82%, were forcibly deported. Others escaped, mostly to the St. Lawrence River Valley in Canada. What's amazing is that throughout these years, in addition to being exiles in British America and France, or imprisoned in England, Acadiens found themselves dispersed all over the world, something I had not known about. And many were in lands claimed by France. I wish I had more time to show you, but they ended up in the Falkland Islands, down in South America, and Haiti, all over the place. And what a marked change of fortune for people who had just been so successful in all their hard work in Acadie. Their greatest suffering was families being separated and children taken away. Was this to be the end of the story? Well, we'll check in with them in a short while. So now it's time to travel to Canada to tell the story of the Canadiens. Now, when I'm referring to Canada in this section, I'm not talking about the Canada of today at all. In the very early years, Canada was only the lands along the St. Lawrence River. So when the French arrived here, the primary indigenous group in the region that would come to be known as Canada were the Algonquins. They too didn't live in farming communities and were semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers, changing location according to the seasons. Well, early on it was easy for the Algonquin to establish trading relations with the French, since they wanted the European goods that made their lives easier. And the French wanted their furs. Things got much more complicated and much more difficult for them later on. So in the beginning, fish and fur were the chief attractions of North America for the French. The first immigrants to Canada were mostly men, and many were involved in the lucrative fur trade, riding rivers all over northern America. And so when they did this, they sang songs that are particularly Canadiens. I've got a couple of short ones, and if you know, some of these are known by people. If you know them, please. Youp, youp, sur la rivière, tu ne m'attendais guère. Youp, youp, sur la rivière, tu ne m'attendais pas. And then, fringue, fringue, sur la rivière, fringue, fringue, sur l'aviron. They're particularly canoe songs. And they were sung a lot by the people who traveled these rivers. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded la ville de Québec. Since our French ancestors immigrated to Canada over 100 years before the French Revolution, there were elements of the feudal system that accompanied them to the Americas. Lands were arranged in long, narrow strips along the St. Lawrence River, and they were called seigneuries. These lands were overseen by seigneurs, and the people who worked the land were called habitants. In this French colony, contrary to what we learned about in Acadie, all power was vested in the monarchy, its representatives, and the Catholic Church. In addition, a strict class system like that existed in France also began in Canada. So as I've mentioned before, unlike in Acadie, the settlers in Canada didn't have the opportunity to learn about different approaches to governance because of the French government and the Catholic churches being stationed right there in Canada, and they both had a very strong presence there. To me, this is a very important distinction because it's one of the things that sets the Acadien experience apart from the Canadien, and it shaped who they became. There were similarities, however, between these two groups. As in Acadie, faith and family meant everything to them. They worked hard in an unforgiving land, and they gathered together in farm kitchens to play music, dance, tell stories, and laugh heartily. These soirées were a source of much joy. Sur la grande côte, elle est montée, sur la grande côte, elle est montée, elle a perdu son tablier. Tila-lit-la-la, tili-la, tila-lit-la-la, tili-lam. Elle a perdu son tablier, elle a perdu son tablier. C'est un homme passant qui l'a ramassé. Tila-lit-la-la, tili-la, tila-lit-la-la, tili-lam. Tila-lit-la-la, tili-la-la, tila-lit-la-la, tili-lam. This is a song from France, actually, that was brought over and retained in Canada. It's a tune of a young girl who is climbing a hill, and she loses her apron, and a young man finds it and brings it to her. And, of course, he wants something from her in return. Maybe a little kiss. Now we're going to fast forward to the 1700s. Things were beginning to change in Canada. The strict class system, originally brought over from France, was actually starting to dissolve, and an air of independence was beginning to stir. Those in Canada began to think of themselves not only as Français, French, but Canadiens, Canadians. It's important to note that this took place in the years before the French Revolution. In France, the concept of independence was not even a reality then at this particular period of time. And concomitantly, intermarriage among the classes became more common. The strict class system started breaking down. And increasingly, church, military, and government leaders were being chosen from among the Canadiens and not brought over from France like they had been in the beginning. These people actually began to believe they might be able to determine their own destiny. Unfortunately, this was short-lived. So here's that date again, 1672. We've already spoken about how this had impacted the Acadiens. Here's what happened in Canada. In 1759, 4 years after Le Grand Dérangement began in Acadie, the British decided to take possession of all the northern lands, and in this effort they spared nothing. On the French side, it was too little, too late, and the French loss on the Battle of the Plains of Abraham ended French domination in the region. The French government's lack of financial support and laissez-faire leadership in the Americas had taken its final toll. Remember earlier we noted that colonization for the British in the Americas was very important, but not so much for the French. It was very important for the British. The following is very significant. There were only 60,000 Canadiens living in that area and 15,000 Acadiens living in Northern America, while in the colonies to the south there were 1.61 million British citizens. It's important to note. So what happened? Well, there was a Treaty of Paris, and it was very significant in the Americas, and as we just noted, it had repercussions on the lives of both the Acadiens and the Canadiens. So with the signing of this treaty, France ceded all its territories in North America, there are a few exceptions, to Great Britain and to Spain. La Nouvelle France was no more. So at the end of the section on the Acadiens, we asked the question, was this to be the end of their story? We find that although dispersed all over the world, the Acadiens had not disappeared. They had found ways to stay in touch, and we're now going to pick up this tale. So, in 1763, with the Treaty of Paris signed, most northern territories were now in British hands. So Acadiens began going up to Canada. Some of their confrères had escaped there before and during the deportation, so there were already Acadiens living in the St. Lawrence River Valley, willing to help them settle there. Acadiens also returned to the Maritime Provinces, the land of their ancestors, but it was a very different story here. Severe restrictions applied. They could only return in very small family groups and were not allowed to go back to their lush family farms because the British planters from New England had taken them over. So they were forced to settle the rocky coastlands. Well, why these restrictions? I'm sure you can figure it out. The British were worried that if they came back in large groups, they would try to retake the territory. And then we cannot forget Louisiana. This region had been under French control, but after the Treaty of Paris, became Spanish territory. And the Acadiens were encouraged to come here by the Spanish government. They settled west of New Orleans and shared the swamps, bayous, and prairies with local Native American tribes. They were also greatly influenced by African Creoles. So Acadiens who came to Louisiana eventually became known as Cajuns. And I have a friend who is from Leominster, who is Cajun, or he'd say he was Acadien, because his ancestors didn't land in Louisiana. But he told me how the word had developed, and I found this very interesting. He said when he was growing up, Acadien was pronounced Acadien, and then it became Cajun, and then was anglicized to Cajun. I thought, that's something I didn't know. So now we want to find out, how did the Treaty of Paris affect the Canadiens? We just talked about the Acadiens. And at this point, we must think of Canada as being both Ontario and Quebec. Nowhere else but those two regions. It has expanded. I remember attending a lecture on Canadian history in Springfield, Mass. In the 1990s. It was given by a historian with a British point of view. She implied the Canadiens never really suffered under British rule in Canada. There was no ethnic cleansing like had taken place in Acadie, that's true. But I contend that the Canadiens did suffer, that their suffering was more hidden but no less impactful. And the next section is complicated, very complicated. So I'm only going to give a very brief overview of what life was like for the Canadiens after the Treaty of Paris was signed. And we'll break it up into two parts, the role of the British and the role of the Catholic Church. For the Canadiens after the British victory, life was pretty much lived under the control of the government and church and state, really. But the state was now British, not French. And you can imagine in these years, tension between these English and French speakers was very high. For after all, the French were the overwhelming majority population in Canada at that time, but it wasn't the government. Because of this, several concessions were made by the British government early on, and these decisions were arrived at primarily because the British were concerned the majority French-speaking population could rebel. And when the French Revolution began in France during this period, British fears became only too real. If their French cousins in France were turning against their government and church, the Canadiens could turn against them. So they continued to make changes to try to placate the Canadiens, but even with those changes, tensions continued. I'll be intentionally vague here because this portion of the history is too complex to dissect in this talk. This I can say. Although the power and influence of Catholic Church leaders in Canada waxed and waned after the British victory, their influence remained significant. In addition,
British leaders eventually realized they could use the considerable influence of the Catholic Church to keep those people down. That is the troublesome Canadiens. In the years to come, this would have serious repercussions on them. So we're going to jump now to the 1840s, 77 years after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and just prior to the time when immigration to the United States began in earnest. So first we ask, how were the Acadiens in the Maritime provinces faring under British rule? Contrary to the period before Le Grand Viragement, the Acadiens were now in a subservient position. According to Professor Mac Faragher in his book A Great and Noble Scheme, the Acadians who had returned to the Maritime region would long remain a subject population. Political conditions and depressed economic realities for the Acadiens in the Maritime provinces kept them oppressed and poor. How were the Canadiens faring under British rule? I'll be very vague here, but I think you will get the point. Suffice it to say, any time a group exercises power and control over another, tries to force them to conform to the power group's expectations, and in this story, there are two groups, government and church, there is pain and suffering. Each time the Canadiens started to believe they might take control of their own lives, something happened to interrupt the process. Events kept church and state powerful, kept the Canadiens powerless. We could say the Canadiens were being crushed by the heavy weight of both church and state. Such dominance tended to make these people like dependent children waiting upon the good grace of the authorities. It is this way of life they took with them to New England. So there were two major waves of immigration of French speakers from the north between the mid-1800s, and it's especially after the American Civil War, to the end of the 19th century, and then again at the end of World War I in the 1920s and 30s. 900,000 to 1 million French speakers from both Quebec and the Maritime provinces eventually left Canada for the United States. This comes from Dr. Yves Raby. The Americans view their Franco-American compatriots as docile, passive, and defeatist creatures, totally lacking in ambition. Although they settled in many different regions in this country, the United States, the Acadiens Canadiens came primarily to New England because industrialization had developed faster here than in Canada and there were many jobs available, and they were very poor. The Acadiens and Canadiens were known to be ideal candidates for the mills. They were hard-working people, skilled and conscientious, but also pliable and not prone to question authority. Recruiters flocked to Canada to entice them to move here. Seemingly overnight, Celtic French speakers were a predominant ethnic presence in this small part of America.
Somebody once asked me what makes the French-Canadian immigration story different from other immigrant stories in New England. I thought that was a fabulous, fabulous question. I want to offer 3 points for our consideration. The first one, we have to remember that there was a long history of animosity between the English in New England and the French in Canada. So because of this history, the French speakers were already a known entity here, and they were not beloved. So as a byproduct of the recruitment effort by mill owners in Canada, a severe social class conflict arose in New England between those who were encouraging immigration, primarily the mill owners who wanted laborers, and the immigrants, and the people felt that the immigrants posed a threat to what they perceived as their land. Sound familiar? With the influx of Acadiens Canadiens, Catholics were also becoming a predominant force in Protestant New England, and long-simmering fear and prejudice erupted to greet the latest arrivals. So in the 1920s, a revised KKK, different from the Klan of the 19th century, primarily anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, and anti-alien, arrived. clan leaders came to the Northeast, and people were recruited to join them in each of the New England states. This from Vermont author and historian Roland E. Robinson. They, the French Canadians, were an abominable crew of vagabonds, robust and lazy men and boys, slatternly women with litters of filthy brats, and all as detestable as they are uninteresting. In the 1930s, forced sterilization was introduced in the state of Vermont. Those families living, and I quote, outside the accepted moral and social convention of middle-class America were, like the Abenaki and the French Canadians, were specifically targeted. So here are the other 2 points that I mentioned about making the immigrant story of the French Canadians different than most other immigrants. Even under these difficult conditions, the Acadiens and the Canadiens didn't leave, but it wasn't an easy transition for them, and here are the 2 other points. So for one thing, and this makes sense, they could easily travel back and forth to the home in the north, and certainly in the beginning they had no intention of settling here. It was only a way to make money so they could go back and run their farms again. But the thing is that New Englanders felt that they weren't serious about settling here, and so a lot of stuff was written about this, and it wasn't complimentary, you can imagine. And the third point is an important one as well, because the question of assimilation into this English-speaking Protestant region was a very complicating factor for them. And we have to understand that before immigration began in earnest, the elite in Canada had been fighting hard against the English push for assimilation in culture and language. The struggle for survival, called la survivance, was intense. Well, they took this struggle to New England, and assimilation was definitely not encouraged by the leadership. However, for many of those leaving their homeland, la survivance wasn't so important. Many were desperately poor, and all they wanted was a better life for their families. So there arose a struggle between the elite and the people. This was the result. Some immigrants changed their names, others changed religion, but most significant to me is this. Many began walking away from their historical and cultural lineage, that is, their story. So many of us Franco-Americans don't know our story. In these next 3 slides, we're going to consider the perspective of 3 well-known Franco-American authors. This is from retired Columbia University professor David Plant in his memoir, American Ghosts. Why should I feel anything but failure? Why should I feel a success in anything when, as a Canuck, it was foregone that I would not succeed? Expect nothing, I told myself. Expect nothing. This from Annie Proulx, Pulitzer Prize-winning Franco-American author, in her book Bird Cloud. Her father married a woman with Yankee roots. And what did it do to us growing up as outsiders? As part of no people except our mother's pale-eyed Yankee clan, who subtly gave us the sense that we were different and somehow tainted. And this from Franco-American author and poet Jacques Kerouac. Because I cannot write my native language and have no native home anymore, and am amazed by that horrible homelessness of all French Canadians abroad in America. A Columbia University professor, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a world-renowned writer, all expressing the same sentiment. Just imagine what hasn't been shared. So I'm just going to give a brief synopsis here, just a few minutes. Our ancestors came to the Northern Americas over 100 years before the French Revolution. Now that event radically changed the mother country, and its people were eventually freed from a very repressive past. They reclaimed their lives, their pride. But our people, their progeny, were not there. They were struggling with their own unique challenges here in the Americas, many of which have been lost to history. For them, profound change was late in coming. It took until the 1960s and 70s for the Québecois, the Acadiens in the Maritime provinces, and the Cajuns in Louisiana, each in their own way, to begin a call for respect. There were rebellions in some areas and some violence, but very little. The people were determined to reclaim their dignity and their pride, and this they have done. Purifier nos cœurs. Purify our hearts. And this meant purify our hearts with great space in which we expect nothing, in which our awareness is the awareness of the great darkness, nothing but darkness. We Canucks prayed for this. We prayed to be ghosts. In the 1960s and 70s, whether we are aware of this story or not, the Québecois and the Acadiens in Canada freed themselves from this self-perception. We Francos in New England were not a part of their freeing experience either. Most of us didn't even know what was happening. Most of us still don't understand the significance of these events in the lives of our northern cousins. As I noted early on, I began my explorations by reading and doing research over a period of many, many years. This work led me to understand something very important, and it is this: that history shapes cultures, it shapes people, it shapes who we become. The story is essential to finding out why we are who we are. For me, reading and study were only the very beginning of an intense personal journey. My work confirmed that what I had experienced as a child was real, that my suffering was real, and that I was not the only one who felt that way. But I also discovered that under the pain was a hidden story. And here it is. The Acadiens and Canadiens were not descended from a weak people. But over centuries, and due to our distinct history first in France and then in the Americas, they had developed a sense of powerlessness in the face of powerful outside forces, both church and state, that had exerted their dominion over them for centuries, telling them who to be, what to think, and what to do. This cannot be downplayed. As a result, some of our people became fatalistic, pliable, and not prone to question authority. They set limited goals, if at all. This is not who they really were. Their true character became lost to them. Now, before I end this section, I want to acknowledge that not all Franco-Americans in New England had these same experiences, because everyone's family is different and everyone's story is different. At the same time, I feel it is necessary to address this painful topic because it was real for many. Yet, while some cities and towns in New England boast voter lists with a majority French surnames, most Franco-Americans go unnoticed. So let's explore this, which was the topic of our presentation this evening. Why are the Franco-Americans such a silent presence here? I'm going to try to explore that with you. There's no simple answer for this. For one thing, I have visited France for many years now with my husband, and I've come to understand that as a culture, the French are a very private people. So part of the silence of the French in New England could be attributable to our nature, our innate nature. But I also believe that there is more to this than a natural tendency toward reticence. Silence can be reflective of many complex issues. It can mirror the inability to articulate deeply held feelings. It's often associated with pain and shame. Sometimes it's the only way to deal with pain. Perhaps this is what happened to our people. Under duress, their soul stepped aside and their spirit went into hiding. None of this is easy to speak about. And talking about pain and shame doesn't mean that I believe our people didn't do it right. Not at all. Today, tonight, we've learned that over the centuries, there were historical events which kept our people down. There's nothing we can do to change this. It's part of our story. In fact, I expect that some people might say, why bother with the past? Well, today, at this time in our history, we are learning that our cultural stories live inside us whether we know the story or not. There's a relatively new science, you've probably never heard of it, it's called epigenetics. And this is showing the truth of this. We all inherit cultural traits. We cannot walk away from the past. On a positive note, this science also makes it clear we don't have to stay stuck in old narratives. I personally experienced the importance of learning the story. This work has changed my life. The shame that once framed my life, and it did, has been transformed into a quiet pride. Now, I'm an introvert, so I'm not going to go out into the streets and yell out this change, but I am happy to share that with you today. By sharing this tale, I believe I'm honoring my ancestors, a proud, stubborn, and courageous people who did the best they could under very challenging circumstances. I am giving a voice to the voiceless. So my question to all of us here is this: going forward, how are we going to tell our story to ourselves and to our families? My hope is that what you've learned today will help you carry it forward with quiet pride. Thank you so much for being here with me this evening. I'm grateful to have been able to be given the opportunity to share this story with you. So I mentioned that if you like to read, I have a list of books, and then on the other side, a list of music sources of our culture. I have a book. I would also like to know if anybody has any questions. Well, thank you so much. Be here if you want anything, if you want my book signed or whatever. The book just has a lot more in it because there's no way that in an hour or an hour and 15 minutes you can tell the entire story in detail. So, thank you for coming.
S'abassant le petit voile, et restait plus qu'on papa. Et du chanteur, autant on sait pas. Que ça tombe, je vais t'en aller en